Okay, so we got cut off at slide 10, and so this is a continuation of this week's lecture. So we're going to talk a little bit about the characteristics of children with speech-language impairments. In general, they might display delays in talking, so they might be late starters. We look back at those red flag moments of first words at 1 year old, 50 words together, or 50 words by 18 months, 2 words together by 24 months, complex sentences and unintelligible by 3. And so these landmarks or these red flag moments are delayed. Students or little ones talk later than expected. They have a shortened or decreased mean length of utterance. So while we might expect a 4.0 MLU from a 4-year-old, a child with a speech and language impairment might have an MLU of 1.5 at the age of 4. So shortened MLUs, shortened mean length of utterances. You might see these children having difficulty engaging by asking questions or sharing ideas such as show and tell, or completing projects like crafts or assignments or completing homework, difficulty engaging with peers, making and establishing friends, problem solving. These kinds of things that impact or are impacted by language. Everything we do involves language, essentially. So difficulties with language impact just about everything we do. You'll notice children who have language impairments use fewer words. Their vocabulary is less broad and less specific. They have a harder time using synonyms, a harder time clarifying if they're misunderstood, and providing alternate ways of saying the same messages. You might notice grammar errors or syntactic errors also. We talked earlier in the semester about the connection between intellect or cognitive development and language. It's very difficult to separate these two, as often cognition is directly related to language acquisition. So while we might not say that a child with cognitive impairment has a specific language impairment, they're not necessarily SLI, they will have delays in their language because of the cognitive deficits. Their disability is cognitive deficit with language impacts. The characteristics of an individual who has cognitive deficits might include some of the information on this slide, and there's some more in your text. I'm not going to detail them out here. Again, the same thing for children with autism. They have a very specific characteristics, specifically that they often look and appear normal in terms of their motor development, their physical appearance, yet they have perhaps different than normal reactions to sensory stimuli, so loud noises, changes in temperature, changes in even location can be upsetting to them. They deal differently with cognition and social skills. They tend to have a decreased tendency towards affection and enjoy relating to things more than they do people. Now, these are very general characteristics of autism, and children with autism are all very unique, and no one child with autism appears to have the exact same characteristics as another child. So these are very generality, speaking in generalities when we talk about the characteristics of individuals with autism. Brain injury is something that occurs or it's an acronym that we call TBI, and it's ever blow to the head, something you can land on your head or be smacked with something on the head, and that's called TBI. CVA is cerebrovascular accident and is often the result of a stroke. All of these incidences, all of these situations cause delays in language. And again, this slide will detail out some of the characteristics of an individual or a child with brain injury. Another type of disability is learning disabilities, And this is often a child who has normal or typical developing cognition and intellectual skills, but they have difficulty learning, or they learn in different manners, perhaps even takes them longer to learn. They need alternate ways of learning, alternate ways of instruction in order to benefit from their educational setting. Children that have learning disabilities often have connected or related language deficits, just as with those that have hearing impairments. Okay, so those are all different types of disorders that may have speech and language delays attached to them because of the nature of the disorder. And then there are specific speech language impairments that are in and of themselves a disability. For example, fluency disorders are those that cause what we would say is stuttering. I think that's the one that most people are familiar with. What do we know about stuttering? We know that there's a genetic predisposition to stutter. We know that it's neurologically based, that the brains of those that stutter fire a little differently, are shaped a little differently in terms of their mass of gray matter and white matter is different in those that stutter. We know that there are environmental contributing factors that can impact the frequency or duration of stuttering, and we know that stuttering happens more often in males than in females. There's a difference between normal disfluencies and stuttering. Normal disfluencies occur between the ages of 3 to 6 years of age, and they last typically less than 6 months. Typically what we see with a normal disfluency is a whole word repetition. So a child might say, what are we doing today? And it's less than 2 iterations. So they'll say, what are we doing today? So 2 times the sound or word is repeated, and that is more typical. Okay. And there's rarely, if any physical symptoms or secondary characteristics. Stuttering, however, often occurs after the age of 5 or 6 years old and lasts longer than 6 months. We see part word repetitions, blocks, sound prolongations, sound repetitions, and they often can have secondary or physical characteristics that go along with it, concurrent behaviors that are aligned or come with the stuttering behavior. So what are some types of disfluencies? Types of disfluencies include part word repetitions, and that's if I would say things like come, computer, that's a part word repetition. Sound prolongation would be something like a feather, and the sound is held onto for a period of time. A block is almost like that break in airflow, so we'd say computer, and there's a break between audible parts of the word. Sound repetition is just that, where the sound in the word is repeated. So it would be like talking to you. Iterations are how many repetitions happen in the word, and so iterations are often a way that we talk about the differences between normal disfluencies and stuttering. It's also a way of measuring the severity of the stuttering, how often and how many iterations happen. Secondary characteristics are physical concomitants or concurrent behaviors. They are very different individual to individual. They could include eye blinking, eye twitch, jaw and facial movements or tics, overt movements in eye contact, raising eyebrows, stomping, swinging of the arms. Not all stutterers exhibit secondary characteristics, and it is, like I said, very particular to each individual. Voice disorders are such that there are changes to the actual quality of the individual's voice. So puberphonia is the extending of an immature vocal pitch beyond the age of puberty. So a young man who perpetuates in a higher pitch voice beyond puberty would be someone who might have puberphonia. There's temporary hoarseness, which we likely all have experienced with laryngitis. There's laryngeal cancer or spasmodic dysphonia, vocal nodules, and aphonia, aphonia being the lack of phonation. Vocal nodules often happen from vocal abuse, and the voice sounds rough and hoarse. Sometimes there's pitch breaks that kind of make your voice almost sound like it's moving in and out, or variations in pitch. Those are called pitch breaks. There are characteristics of, say, Parkinson's disease that are very typical, such as tremors in the voice, that are characteristics that we hear that are specific to changes in the use of muscles in the vocal folds. When we say something is a voice disorder anytime there is something that goes wrong with the vocal folds, such as swelling, irritation, and it usually results in some sort of distortion to the vocal quality. If we back up a little bit here, I'm going to go back to when we're talking about the delays of characteristics of individuals with speech and language impairments. We talked in brief before about errors of speech sound disorder. So the child might have a lisp or a distorted R, or they might have difficulty planning the syllables out in a word, so weak syllable deletion, or they delete S in a cluster of words and they might have cluster reduction. So they might say no man for snowman. We talked about those kinds of things. So when we talk about another type of speech and language impairment, which would be an expressive or receptive language disorder. Expressive is what you say, receptive is what you understand. And an expressive disorder might be more obvious when it appears as grammar changes. So the child has difficulty using the correct word or the correct verb tense or the correct pronoun in using their speaking. They may have trouble telling a story. Their stories may be circumlocutive. Their stories may include details that are non-essential. They may tell a story that assumes shared knowledge or that is out of sequence. They may have difficulty using complex sentence structures. They may have difficulty making inferences or thinking critically or answering higher order questions, such as why do you think the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts and stayed there? Why didn't they go south where it was warmer? Or questions of, what would you, how would you vote in the next election? And being able to verbalize their ideas coherently. A receptive language disorder might appear with difficulties following directions, difficulties categorizing information or sorting information that they're learning. So being able to put things into new schema through assimilation and accommodation, being able to identify differences in objects and explain why those differences exist, being able to listen to a story and answer questions, being able to comprehend literature or text or a command, being able to tell the difference between a question or declarative. Receptive language might impact not only their ability to follow directions, but just to listen in general and to process information that's being spoken to them. So that should be a little bit helpful as you're working towards completing your assignment this week in giving me some specifics about what the characteristics of individuals with different types of speech and language impairments are. There are 2 lectures, so make sure you've listened to both of them and have a great evening.